Shadow Minister Louise Hay.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. And can I begin by thanking the Lords in the other place for their careful consideration of this bill, which is certainly in better shape than when it left this chamber. Now, as the Minister has outlined, we have offered our sincere and constructive support throughout the passage of this legislation in supporting the Government and their attempts to respond to the surge in violent crime. We offered our support in committee stage, report and at third reading. We have fought to enhance protections on the sale of knives, to close dangerous loopholes in our gun laws, to force the Home Office to release evidence on the consequences of cuts to vital services, on the levels of serious violence, to force the Government to assess whether the police have the resources they need to tackle violence involving offensive weapons, and to put the rights of victims of crime on a statutory footing, a right which has been neglected despite repeated manifesto promises from the Conservative Party. And let's not forget, Madam Deputy Speaker, the absolutely farcical spectacle of the Home Secretary at second reading of this bill and Minister through committee making the case for a ban on high-powered rifles, guns that have an effective range of 6 kilometres, and then coming back to the chamber at report stage and making the exact opposite case in the face of backbench rebellion. I would just say this, Madam Deputy Speaker. Our gun laws are in need of updating, and it is a sad reflection that all the passage of this bill has done is weaken the provisions on firearms and kick the can down the road once again in pushing the issue to consultation. Furthermore, the bill as it stands still ignores much of the key evidence contained in a leaked Home Office report on the drivers of serious violence. This included compelling evidence that violence was, in part, being driven by a precarious and vulnerable youth cohort, shorn of the support and early intervention and prevention work necessary to stop those vulnerable people from falling into a spiral of serious violence. Turning to the specific amendments, I'm grateful to the work of the noble Lord Kennedy and the work of my honourable friends, the member for Sheffield Central and Sheffield South East, who have managed to find a consensus on the delivery of knives to residential premises that protects children while not unduly hampering specialist knife manufacturers and businesses. So we're happy to support the amendment in the name of the Home Secretary today. The amendment drafted will need to prove shows that businesses will need to prove they have taken all necessary measures to ensure a knife is delivered into the hands of an adult, or they will feel the full weight of the law. So we are happy to support it. On Kirpans and Sikh ceremonial swords, my congratulations again to my honourable friends, the member for Slough and to Birmingham Edgbaston. We understood the concerns from across the House, and I am pleased that the Labour Lords Amendment has been accepted, which will allow Sikhs to practice their religion freely without fear of criminalisation. But undoubtedly the biggest change has been the introduction of knife crime prevention orders, and it is this I wish to focus my remarks on. It is important when making any changes to the suite of police powers that Parliament has the full opportunity to consider evidence and their implications. That is why we are extremely concerned about both the way in which these have been brought forward and some of the content of the orders that are being proposed today. Our concerns are threefold, and I will address them in turn, and our amendments, as the Minister has said, speak to those concerns. Firstly, it is regrettable there has been little to no parliamentary scrutiny and far below the standard you would expect for potentially punitive orders which impose criminal sanctions on children as young as 12. Secondly, there is no statutory requirement on for the needs of the child who may be subject to an order to be assessed, to establish what their circumstances are and what support may be beneficial. This eschews all evidence for combating youth violence, which is clear that the focus should be on avenues for a route out of crime and not on punitive restrictions. Finally, we are extremely concerned that the lack of consultation and evidence base for these orders may lead to them doing more harm than good. So on parliamentary scrutiny, Madam Deputy Speaker, this is not just some narrow concern on process. The orders carry criminal sanctions of up to 2 years' custodial sentence for a breach. The civil standard of proof could find a child on the receiving end of a prison sentence for breach of an order that was itself imposed only on the balance of probabilities. It is wholly inappropriate to have introduced such potentially punitive penalties in the House of Lords, once scrutiny in the Commons had already taken place of the bill, and for this to have been the first limited opportunity for the Commons to debate them. During committee stage, we took evidence from a wide range of witnesses, including the police and counter-terror police, on the need to ban 50 calibre rifles, which was later dismissed by the government. At no point were these orders mentioned, and it is regrettable that they may enter legislation with such little scrutiny and with such little opportunity to test the opinion of experts in the field of youth violence. Now, we were pleased that our colleagues in the other place fought and won for these to be delivered initially as a pilot, so it will be possible for authorities to test the orders and learn lessons before they are rolled out across the country. But as we have seen, unfortunately, we still do not have any further detail on where those pilots will be, how long those pilots will last for, what report will be laid before this House once those pilots have been completed. The amendment that has been brought forward by this government does not go far enough, and that is why we have tabled amendments which would establish a parliamentary lock on the rollout of knife crime prevention orders, allowing Parliament to review the evidence, examine the pilots and their effectiveness, see the departmental justification and be assured that proper monitoring regimes are in place to monitor their use before any wider rollout. We would require the government to report on which practitioners have been consulted. It is astonishing that the Youth Justice Board, the Children's Commissioner, local government services, none of them were involved in drawing these orders up. And since they've been published, the Magistrates Association, the Association of Youth Offending Team Managers and the Local Government Association have all voiced their concerns.
Just to correct the record, these orders have been discussed in the Serious Violence Task Force, where the Children's Commissioner and others, many of the others that she mentions, attend. As I say, this was an action that the police has required of us. Very quickly, we turned it around as quickly as we could to get it into this bill in order to protect children. We're doing it on the advice of the police.
I would respectfully suggest, Madam Deputy Speaker, that discussing orders that are to be put before Parliament that would criminalise children for up to 2 years requires more than a discussion at a meeting. It requires full consultation, it requires full parliamentary scrutiny, and none of that has happened. So before Parliament approves any rollout, the Government should release a report giving an explanation of what guidance has been given to authorities on the burden of proof, which, as we know, is a civil standard, the impact of orders on the rights of children, and the impact on different racial groups as defined in Section 9 of the Equality Act 2010.
I'm grateful to the honourable lady for giving way. Does she not think it's a bit rich that on the one hand she's complaining about the government introducing a full consultation on a whole range of firearms issue enshrined in statute under this bill, and on the other hand complaining that the government hasn't consulted enough on knife crime orders, which are suggested by the police and in my view a much needed armoury in the fight against knife crime?
The government consulted on the ban on weapons ahead of this bill, and on the basis of evidence from the most senior counter-terror police in the country, concluded that it was right to ban the assault rifle. It was only in response to a backbench rebellion led by the honourable gentleman that the government caved and made the exact opposite case that they made at second reading. Now, these, Madam Deputy Speaker, are very basic requests and, in truth, information that Parliament should already have when being asked to pass legislation. The parliamentary lock we are seeking to add to the orders should not be necessary, but we know the damage that can result from a lack of joined-up thinking in youth justice, and our communities simply cannot afford another misstep. That's why it's only right that parliamentarians are given the full facts before being asked to approve further rollout. Now, turning to the content of the orders themselves, all of us in this place are united in our mission to do everything in our power to bear down on the terrible scourge of knife crime. But we must be wary of taking action for the sake of action, and interventions must be evidence-based, have a clear purpose and fill a gap in the existing legislation. The police already have a substantial suite of powers for those they suspect of possessing a knife. The issue is, and has been for several years, the ability and the capacity of the police to enforce those powers. As the Chair of the Police Federation said, how the Home Secretary thinks we have the officers available to monitor teenagers' social media use or check they're at home at 10 p.m. when we're struggling to answer 999 calls is beyond me. The government has taken 21,000 police officers off our streets. Response times have rocketed. In some force areas, residential burglaries are rarely attended. The capacity for the police to respond to crime has been extremely diminished, so it is beyond doubt that they do not have the capacity to place orders on people who have not actually committed a crime and then effectively monitor and implement those orders. There has been no impact assessment on the resource implications for the police or any of the other services that may be brought in by these orders. We are concerned, and this is what our amendments speak to, that in trying to establish so-called wraparound care for young people, these orders will inevitably end up focusing on the restrictive elements, such as curfews, social media bans and prohibitions, rather than the potential for positive rehabilitative action. I think we have now reached consensus in this place that in order to effectively combat youth violence, a whole system, cross-governmental public health approach is required. And these orders could have been an attempt to bridge that divide, but instead they place sole responsibility on the police as the only authority that can apply for an order, and this risks narrowing the focus of the suite of options available. The fact that there is no statutory requirement to assess the needs of a child, establish their circumstances, consider the safeguarding implications of an order, nor their family history prior to an order being granted, should be fatal for a legislative proposal that the government has styled as a route to access wraparound services. It simply does not do what is required. And that is why our amendments establish a statutory requirement to consult with the yacht to produce a pre-sentence report. But we're satisfied with the Minister's commitment today that this will be made clear in guidance. Furthermore, I wonder whether the government, in using the example of a youth worker to be responsible for the delivery of an order, recognises the bind they would be putting such an individual in if they were responsible for reporting any breaches to the police. Central to a public health approach is a consistent, constant adult in vulnerable young people's lives, and this could provide an opportunity for that, but it can't if such individuals are then forced to report them to the criminal justice system every time they don't abide by the conditions laid down in their order. Now, I'll round up, Madam Deputy Speaker, with a number of questions I hope the Minister can respond to when she speaks again. The civil burden of proof is concerning, so what sort of intelligence does the Minister envisage would be sufficient for a court to grant an order? Will the police use the gang matrix to target individuals? Will association with known offenders be sufficient for an order to be placed? Will past offending be sufficient, as the Minister in the other place appeared to suggest? Does the Minister share concerns of members across the House that we risk criminalising children as young as 12 who have not actually committed a criminal offence? Does she really believe that a 2-year custodial sentence is proportionate to a breach of a civil order, and can she give an example of when such a sentence would be appropriate? What exactly can KCPOs require or prohibit? Will guidance be brought forward on what measures are effective in tackling knife crime, or is it anything that the court deems necessary, proportionate and enforceable? And finally, who is required or allowed to know that a child has an order, and what action is their school or alternative provider expected to take when one has been granted? The implications for alternative provision are potentially severe, as some providers refuse to take children who have knife convictions, leaving them completely out of education and therefore much more vulnerable to becoming involved in violence. So what consideration has been given to this? Now, I don't think the Minister has satisfactorily answered concerns from this side of the House and raised in our amendments, and from expert organisations that work on these issues every single day, such as the Magistrates Association and the Association of Youth Offending Teams. So we will divide the House on our amendment in relation to a parliamentary lock, and that the report that the Home Secretary brings must be voted on before these pilots can be rolled out. Can I conclude, Madam Deputy Speaker, by thanking and congratulating my honourable friends that have significantly improved this bill and subjected it to scrutiny as it has passed through the House. In particular, my right honourable friend for East Ham, the honourable members for Sheffield Central and South East, my honourable friend for Lewisham Deptford, and my honourable friends for Croydon Central, Birmingham Edgbaston and Slough. The amendments in our names have sought to strengthen and improve the weak legislation before us today. They have sought an evidence-based response to the long-term trend in violence that we are witnessing as a result of this government's austerity agenda. We hope the government will accept that much more needs to be done if we are to prevent any more young lives from being needlessly taken, and will accept the amendments in our name today.